All right, and with that, let's get started today. So thank you everyone so much for joining us for Mitigating Bias in Machine Learning, a McGraw Hill Access Engineering webinar. We are so excited to have our panel of experts speak to us today about mitigating bias in machine learning. I'm going to introduce those experts, but before I do, let me just do some quick housekeeping. A few of you have heard these before, but you're all muted. Cameras are off, I promise. So you're totally good in that regard. Um, the chat is open. So should you have any questions throughout the webinar today, please post those to the chat. And me and another McGraw Hill coworker, we're going to organize those. We're going to present those to the speakers at the end of the session today. So if you have questions, feel free to submit them in the chat in real time, or you can save them until the Q&A at the end. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and everyone who registered will get a link to the recording following today's session. And with that, it is my honor to introduce our great experts today who are going to be guiding us as we learn and converse about mitigating bias in machine learning. So first, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Carlotta A. Berry, who is a professor. Well, I'll read the whole thing, this whole beautiful bio she has. So Dr. Carlotta A. Berry is a professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. Dr. Berry is the first Black woman to earn tenure, full professor, and endowed chairship at Rose-Hulman. She has a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Spelman College, bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology, master's in electrical engineering from Wayne State University, and PhD from Vanderbilt University. Her research interests are in robotics education, interface design, human-robotic interaction, and increasing historically marginalized and minoritized populations in STEM fields. She is the author of the book Mobile Robotics for Multidisciplinary Study and co-editor of Mitigating Bias in Machine Learning. She's also the Lawrence J. Giacoletto. Oh, I sure hope I said that right. Sorry. Dr. Berry, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Lawrence J. Giacoletto Endowed Chair in Electrical and Computer Engineering. All right. If you needed evidence that this is a live webinar, there you go. All right, and now I am also honored and excited to introduce Dr. Brandeis Marshall, CEO of DataedX Group LLC. Brandeis Marshall is an entrepreneur, author, and data equity strategist. Formerly a college professor, she brings her instructional design and delivery expertise to help leaders across sectors and industries clarify their data strategy in order to align people, processes, practices, and policies. She also founded Black Women in Data in 2020 to help Black women invest in their career and leadership development as data entrepreneurs, leaders, managers, and practitioners. Dr. Marshall speaks, writes, and consults on how to move slower and build better people-first tech. She has been a Stanford PACS Practitioner Fellow and Partner Research Fellow at, Seigel Family Endowment at Seigel Family Endowment. She has served as faculty at both Purdue University and Spelman College. Her scholarly work in data literacy and fluency, data/AI ethics, and computing has been supported by the National Science Foundation and philanthropy organizations. Dr. Marshall is the author of Data Conscience, Algorithmic Siege on Our Humanity, and co-editor of Mitigating Bias in Machine Learning. She's also a contributing author in The Black Agenda. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Berry and Dr. Marshall. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having us.
This is so awesome. Take it away, Carlotta.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. So why is this text needed? We wanted to start off our webinar by talking about the textbook and why such a time as now is why we need it. What we have discovered is that as AI has moved from an abstract concept to a decision-making agent, even in the last week, we've been hearing about places that it may be used that were never used before. Concerns have grown about how it will impact people's lives. These concerns are rooted in the fact that we have discovered that there is bias in artificial intelligence and machine learning, and this bias has led to discrimination and injustice. So this textbook seeks to contribute educational resources to this space that discuss this impact to amplify diverse voices and perspectives in artificial intelligence and machine learning, because we know those are the communities that will be the first to be impacted, to highlight disparities in real world practical implications and provide recommendations on how these we can lessen some of these harmful effects. So I'm now going to let Dr. Marshall highlight some of the topics.
Yes. So if you have the book, would love to know if you have the book, even digital or physical. So please put that into the chat. So we received a lot of different chapters, different topics, because AI is everywhere. So what Carlotta and I wind up doing is trying to categorize the submissions in a way that would be palpable for you, and also a way in order to tell a story about where AI could be used, how it has been used, and then, of course, reinforce this notion of practical implications, right? So the topics that we first start out with bias and ethics in machine learning. We wanted to do our best in order to, at the very beginning, just talk about the thing. Let's just talk about bias and where it shows up and what are some of the harmful ways in which we've seen it manifest. Then we move on to large language models and bias, because we wanted to make sure that we give homage to generative AI that has taken over a lot of the conversation over the past 2 years. So we, of course, have sorry, I already was putting doctor in front of your name, Jasmia. It's coming. So it's coming. So Jasmia Henry is going to be talking about large language models. Next, we have bias frameworks. And first, we talk about fairness in systems, and then we move on to fairness in software. So we do separate out what's happening in systems versus what's happening in software for obvious reasons, because AI tools and platforms and algorithms are used in multiple ways throughout systems and software. The next topic that we talk through is healthcare. Now, we know that there is a lot of AI algorithms that have been applied to the healthcare arena. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a conversation around what some of those challenges have been, and then what are some of the remedies that have been helpful to multiple communities. Okay. The next topic is social ecological systems. Yes, we're talking about environmental type of justice. What does that look like? What's the impact of the systems that AI, especially generative AI, is consuming? And what is that impact on our society and on our world? So we do have Dr. Monroe White in order to discuss an aspect of that social ecological, the environmental justice arena.
That's right. Let's go.
It's just, it's a tongue twister for me. It is just
We
a
got
tongue.
it.
I can't get the words out of my mouth. Okay.
All good.
And then last but not least, our last topic that we cover in the book is natural language processing. And now this is words that we have heard for about 2 decades, because this is all about text and text manipulation. And so we did not want to have a topic in the book that did not cover what happens when it comes to text manipulations, because that is so prevalent. As we have all seen in our emails, we're getting suggestions on what to say and what to write. So we did want to provide at least a section around what is happening when it comes to those text suggestions that aren't what you really want to say. All right. So those are the topics that we cover. But as we even discovered these topics, there was so much diversity in how all of the authors laid out their cases that Carlotta and I had to come together and go, okay, let's now put some structure around this to make sure that all of you that are reading the book, those that are using within your courses, could have a way in order to understand how to communicate that with students, or even just to understand it better for yourselves, especially if you happen to be AI adjacent. So that meant that we now have a chapter format, and every chapter is formatted in a way in order to help not only students, but also instructors in order to understand the topics a little bit easier. So we have a certain categories that we march through in every single chapter. So the chapter all start out with a question. So we always have a motivating question. Next up is learning objectives. Yes, we're educators, so there will be learning objectives. Okay. Number 3 is overview. So we do provide almost like an abstract or a summary. So each chapter does have that component. So if in case you don't, not sure if you like the chapter or not in your class, or you want to read it, you don't really sure if you really want to know about that topic, you have an overview that you can get a nice synopsis. Then there is an implementation or an experimentation or a methodology component. So that kind of gets you into the details. That tends to be the longest section in the book in that particular chapter. Then each chapter rounds out with a summary. That's a very short summary of what was discussed in the chapter and what were the high level takeaways. And then it always ends with a series of exercises or discussion points. So if you are trying to introduce this topic inside of your course, or you want to know more for yourself, you now have a place to go in order to have points of conversation. So that's how we've organized the book, with the topics as well as each chapter's format. And so with that, Dr. Berry, take it away.
And now we are ready for our fireside chat. So hopefully you have your coffee, your hot cocoa, and your fire is blazing. The first thing I would like to do is to introduce our wonderful author contributors. First is Jasmia Henry, is an AI research engineer specializing in AI alignment, ML ops for large language models, and experimental design. As the founder and principal AI researcher at it's my turn now. ISO AI. She developed innovative tools, including ISO Pro and ISO Zero, for multi-agent reinforcement learning and adversarial testing. Currently, she's doing a doctorate in philosophy in social data science at the University of Oxford. Dr. Monroe White is an associate professor of artificial intelligence and innovation policy at the Schar School of Policy and Government and the Department of Computer Science Joint at George Mason University. As an interdisciplinary scholar, her work explores the systemic biases that affect the workforce and educational journeys of racially minoritized groups within science, engineering, and information technology fields. Welcome to our 2 author contributors. Our first question is going to be for Jasmia. And the question is, what are some examples of how we see bias in large language models?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So there are the ways that large language models have been experiencing bias. I'll call it pre-AI agent, and then in the new space we're in right now when it comes to AI agents. So pre-AI agent, that could be something as simple as associations, co-occurrence of words being associated between people of marginalized groups, people who have been historically excluded, and negative association. So that could be something as simple as, Dr. Sophia Noble on the cover of her book, Algorithms of Oppression. It shows a Google search, and it just says Black women. And underneath it, you can see the top related associations for Black women. So it says Black women are angry, Black women are, unattractive, all of these things, these associations end up popping up in large language models because large language models have been trained largely on web-based data. And so that's one of the ways that it has popped up traditionally in large language models. And there's been these guardrails to try to protect those things. But then we have the AI agents, which have been coming out and getting more powerful recently, which are what happens when decisions are being added on top of negative associations. And so it becomes this amplification effect. You might have an association with Black women, for example, that might be negative. And then now you're asking an AI agent who should be given care. Maybe it might be a healthcare type of situation and you have a limited amount of supplies. And so based off the association that, certain groups might be undesirable, certain groups might be more likely to be unhealthy, certain groups might not be worthy of care, now decisions are being made off of that. So those dual things end up making bias end up, being very harmful towards people who have already been harmed by our society.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Marshall?
Yes. Okay. So we're going to build off of Jasmia's question because now I'm going to switch it over to Dr. Tama and ask you a question that's about these disparities, these social inequities. So here's the question. Can you provide examples of social inequities being amplified via machine learning approaches?
Yes, thank you for the question, and great to be here with all of these stellar stars in the field. I'm so grateful. So I'll start with the list, and again, building exactly on Jasmia's comments. So machine learning models are trained on data that reflect real world harms. That's the world we live in. And so subsequently, because these models are focused on automation optimization, they're amplifying, right, with greater efficiency and scale, the kinds of harms that we see embedded. And so the ways that this shows up in the healthcare domain, for example, we have algorithms that recommend reducing the number of Black patients identified for additional care by greater than 50% compared to equally ill white patients. This is a study in Science. In education sectors, you have algorithms that are assigning grades favoring students from private schools and harming students from lower socioeconomic areas. In the criminal justice system, many of you might be familiar with this, we have recidivism risk models that are twice as likely to misclassify Black offenders as reoffending compared to white offenders. In search, we already mentioned Dr. Sophia Mojanoble's work with association of Black women and Black girls being associated with profane search term results. In technology, we have facial recognition, right? That's disproportionately misclassifying darker skinned females compared to lighter skinned males. And this is the famous work of Joy and Timney. And then in hiring, right, we had Amazon system that was penalizing resumes that included the word women's, like Women's Chess Club, Clapton, and downgrading graduates of all women's colleges. So the list goes on. This is just a snapshot view, but to give you a taste of the ways that these machine learning approaches are amplifying, there's really no domain that we're not seeing the harm, right, show up. And so in these various chapters and in the textbook, I think you'll see everyone pulling in some degree, in some capacity. How do you tackle these?
Oh my God, thank you so much. And the list does go on and on. It's almost as if every week there's a new thing that the bias comes out, right? Even in Galactica, that Meta tried to do about 2 years ago, it was trying to pull together all the scientific research to create new science outcomes and findings, but it wind up being not a benefit. It was telling people to eat glass and some other interesting things. So there's a lot of examples where bias can harm not only historically excluded groups, but just society in general. So we have to make sure to keep our eye on the fact that bias is more and deeper than just historically excluded groups, even though historically excluded groups are most severely and first impacted. So I'm going to get off my soapbox. Dr. Carlotta, take the next question.
Absolutely. And so I think just as you and Dr. Monroe White were saying, as the book is being written, we're seeing more examples. So we're almost ready for edition 2 of the book by the time edition 1 came out, because we're going to keep finding
Lord, girl,
more
what are you talking
examples.
about? What you talking about? What the don't put that out there.
I know. Okay, sorry.
Keep that on the inside.
Take that back. Take that back. So we've talked about a little bit of some of where we see some of these inequities, but we also want to talk about some ways that we can mitigate some of this bias. So this next question is for Jasmia. What are 1 or 2 examples or some of your top recommendations for ways that we can mitigate some of these impacts?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that the top way is by the power of human annotators. I think that it gets undermined because when people think about AI, especially to reflect some of your words, Dr. Berry, when we first were writing this book, I believe it was ChatGPT was kind of new and everyone was trying to figure out how this was actually going to affect the world. And from us as researchers, we had experience with these types of things, but we weren't sure how the population was going to use it. And so I think that at that time, there was this kind of thing of, okay, well, every solution has to be a technical solution. We have to have, some really good algorithms to fight the really bad algorithms. And that's going to be the way that we can really begin to do these things. And now that we've had some time to see how this beginning to come about, it's very clear to me that the power of humanity is the best way of being able to mitigate these processes, especially with these natural language outputs. And so this can be anything from as small as, just an eye test. You ask a large language model a question, you read through it and you figure out the implications, and then you ask it a follow-up question and say, hey, you said this, don't say this in relation to this, say these other words, or keep in mind these ideas. And there's some wonderful prompting techniques that come out of that. They have plan and solve plus prompts, which are essentially, take each step, think about each step, and have this outcome. And you can put in there things that make sure that the large language model isn't deviating, of course. And then, of course, there's human in a loop, which is a little bit more technical. But it can be something as simple if you have multiple expressions of words that might, of prompts that might be coming from a large language model that might be biased, being able to go through and reading transcripts. And every time, you have a score that might be a low score, and I'm going to get into these scores in a second, but a low score when it comes to equity, then you can say, okay, you need to change on these things. So being able to evaluate the spread of these negative scores. When I talk about scores, and this is the second recommendation, that's where that tech piece comes in a little bit more. So there has been some wonderful researchers who have come up with equity scores. There's quite a few of them. There's the equal odds parity metrics. There's a demographic parity metrics. And so essentially what they do is it looks at, for those of you who are familiar with the confusing matrix, so it looks at how many times has there been a false positive towards a certain group compared to a major group, so compared to the hegemony. And so if you see that, people of color might have had more positive false positives when it comes to, say, instances of recidivism, it can provide a score there. And so, using a combination of those two is very powerful to be able to stop these models from getting out of hand.
Thank you so much, Jasmia. And so I was thinking humans in the loop and diverse humans in the loop, because we also have seen what happens when we have these models that are trained on data that's not very diverse, or teams that are not very diverse, because then some bias will show up because no one was on the team who identified with that demographic group to even be able to say, hey, what about brown skin? We don't have anybody brown skinned in the team to actually check this on. So I am now going to transition and get off my soapbox back to Dr. Marshall.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversation that you're going to see in all these chapters around what is the relationship and interaction between people and technology. Every chapter has this element of like, yes, there is a tech side, but there's also a human side, and they need to work together. We cannot just say it's one or the other. They need to work together. And how do we make this fusion happen? Because to earlier points, if there's not enough voices and representation for folks who are not predominant in our society, then they get overlooked and marginalized and pushed aside, and and the impacts to them is even more amplified. So with that said, there's one more question that we have for the panel, and this is to Dr. Thema. And this is really a question specifically about your work, right? Because you work very squarely in racial and gender, and you've created a protocol called, Wells du Bois. And I wanted you to provide the audience with, number one, what is the Wells du Bois protocol? But then also, how can this protocol address disparity, right? Because I mean, there's more than equity scores out there that can help with the levers. So tell us about Wells-Dubois protocol and, of course, how it addresses disparity within these systems.
Thank you again. Happy to. So in my co-authors, Joe Bozeman and team at Georgia Tech, when we were looking at submitting a chapter for the textbook, we really wanted to marry this view on socio-ecological systems, right, which is Dr. Bozeman's area of expertise, and looking at the social and ecological dimensions of data and systems and how those have real policy implications. With this tool that I developed with my co-author, Jessie Lisi, which was a diagnostic tool. So the Wells-Dubois or Wells-Du-Bois, you can pick your choice,
Sorry, I said it the French way.
It's all good. It's all good. I've heard all types, and I'm not going to, that's not the point, right? The point is that it's named after two pioneering leaders and data activists, scholars in the space. And so we start with the history lesson, right? So if you don't know who Ida B. Wells is, you need to know, or W.E.B. Du Bois. So Ida B. Wells was a data journalist, anti-lynching advocate, among other things. And she wrote The Red Record, a famous book I encourage you to read if you have not already. W.E.B. Du Bois, a sociologist, human rights scholar, also known as the visual theorist of race. His data visualizations really helped to capture and shed light on the Black experience in America at a time when the humanity of Black people was being questioned. And so these two leaders, for me, help to shine a light. They give the historical grounding for where we are today and why we are where we are today, right, with these existing systems. So the protocol was designed as a simple checklist style tool. It was designed to be efficient, like the Bechdel test. If you're familiar with the Bechdel test, similar to it's being used to identify gender bias in film. So to pass the test, you have to be able to answer the question, do you have two women who talk to each other about something other than a man? That's the Bechdel test. If you can say that, you pass. And so similarly, this checklist style tool was designed to be a kind of efficient way for you to go through as you're approaching your machine learning, your project, and you're looking at your data and you're structuring it, you're trying to decide, okay, am I being thoughtful as I curate, analyze, right, and summarize these findings? What can you do? And so the checklist entails three primary categories, which we go into in the chapter. And we apply it to a case of publicly available data on a consumer expenditure survey related to socioeconomic status, food expenditure in US dollars, about 130,000 observations. So a sizable enough sample that you can analyze. And we give you real world cases that you can use the data sets to explore. So the characteristics of the Wells-Du Bois protocol include data quality or bad data, right? Mm-hmm. So what are some indicators that you've got bad data? Well, inadequate data. We've already touched on this a bit before. I think Dr. Berry mentioned this, right? When your data set underrepresents certain, often marginalized populations, right, within your large data set, that's a problem. If we think about the facial recognition model, right, harms, it stemmed from that, right, kind of underrepresentation. We also highlight what we call tendentious data. And tendentious data is demonstrated when the algorithm accurately reproduces human bias. Meaning, we know there's bias in the real world. Think recidivism risk. We know that there is over-incarceration of Black people and Black males in particular. So the algorithm does that and more, right? Does that and better. And so that's reflecting human bias, but we need to label those and recognize those as different things, right? It's important to recognize there are systems that are inherently biased. And so the model, in doing its good job, is doing a good job at reproducing that. We also have bad algorithms, and we classify bad algorithms in three different ways. First is harms of identity proxy. Some of you might have also found that folks would say, well, as long as we remove race or remove certain demographic characteristics from our data set, we're good, because then we're not having problems with that. That's not the case, right? Removing race or any other protected class from a data set will not erase the problem. In fact, algorithms are excellent pattern detection systems, right? So the pattern may be invisible to humans, but they'll correlate say zip code, for example, a common example, with race, and we'll find that there's disparities along zip code, which happen to highly correlate with race or other characteristics, so socioeconomic status. Another harm in this bucket of algorithmic bias or bad algorithms are harms of subpopulation difference. So when your overarching model tells you one story, does the same model stand up when you break it up into subpopulations, right? It's often the case that overall, we say the global story looks one way, but when you look locally, there are very different patterns that emerge. So it's important to disaggregate. And so having enough data to do that as well. The compass algorithm is another example of this, right? If you don't analyze at the subpopulation level, you're going to lose insight. Next, we have harms of misfit models. So we've talked a little bit about model fit, I believe, overfitting, underfit models, right? But it's so often the case when it comes to social and socio-ecological systems that less accurate models may be more useful for society than more accurate ones. So for example, if you have 1% of all women are diagnosed with breast cancer at age 45, let's say that's just a statistics that we have. A test that concludes that 0 women have breast cancer is 99% accurate and 100% useless, right? Like it does not, that is not the whole story there. And we focus on accuracy. So again, we talked about this a little bit before. I'd like us to disaggregate. We have to be thoughtful in terms of that, the confusion matrix that Jasmine brought up before. There are 4 quadrants for a region. It's very important to pay attention to the different quadrants, right? If you just focus on one, you're going to lose part of the story, right? And you're missing some really important patterns that can be having underlying your data. Finally, there's human intention. So we already talked about the human dimensions of data. There's only so much that you can solve with a technical solution. There's just limits to it, and I'm happy that there's limits to it. I want to also embrace the human dimensions of data and say, first, let's have a do no harm clause. So with Cambridge Analytica, for example, it was a scandal because it used sophisticated analytics to target marginalized and minoritized populations with misinformation to create a sense of frustration so that when the political process made its way through, they were less likely to identify these individuals to vote. You don't have bad intentions. If you do have bad intentions, that's a problem, right? We need to be able to flag those harmful intention actors because it does happen. And then there's harms of ignorance. Even with the best of intentions, algorithms can perform amazingly well on intended tasks, but then downstream effects don't consider potential harms, and then we suffer the consequence. So to conclude for this protocol, again, it's 7 items. You go through, you walk through each one, and you really examine, you ask questions. And in answering those questions, you're prompted to look at the data set that you have. It can be a socio-ecological system or any system. And you can say, how am I low lift addressing some of these potential biases and the ways that they can creep in. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the mini lecture because it was really good. And I know being the fact I'm a former professor. And so I do just appreciate the fact it was succinct. Thank you, Dr. Tema. And very helpful to provide that context around it because there's a lot of different places in which the disparities are seen, and we can't always put them in the same bucket. And it's important that we do separate them out. I think at the very end, when you talked through the last 2 points, to me, that resonated the most because you're talking about misinformation versus disinformation. And that is something that we're seeing more and more in today's AI conversation and world is how do we assess whether or not it's misinformation, unintended negative intentions versus disinformation, which is intended bad actors trying to push along a particular narrative. So thank you for the questions and the answers. And now we're going to actually open it up because we want to hear from you with some of your questions. We know we have talked quite a bit. We've had our book chapter authors share a little bit of their perspective given their specialized expertise. But let's open it up for Q&A. So I don't know how this is supposed to work. Do we go into the Q&A? Oh, there's someone coming on the screen. Woohoo! Woo! Yay!
Yay! Hello. I am here as your question, not bot. I'm a real person, but I'm here to be the stand-in for the audience. So, audience,
You are the question agent. Got it.
I am the question agent. Thank you. So we have gotten some great questions in the chat and in the Q&A. I'll just send a reminder to everyone. If you do want to submit a question, please do, and you can do so openly in the chat. But if you want to send a question privately through Q&A, you can do that too and send it anonymously. That's absolutely fine. So let me just start with some of the questions we've gotten. So first, this comes from Angela Wells. I believe it was Wells. Yes. So Angela asks, are there any frameworks currently guiding the ethical development of ML applications in healthcare?
Good question. I'm not aware of any applications, but we do have a couple of healthcare chapters in the book. And so I think if you look at those chapters, I'm hoping they have the applications in there as well. Brandeis, do you know?
I do not know if there is frameworks for the ethical development, mainly because there's a lot of questions around the ethics around using AI within the healthcare arena due to the bias as well as the training of healthcare professionals not necessarily having a cultural competency. So there's layers effects to this, right? We already know that women's healthcare doesn't receive as much research dollars as men's healthcare. We already know that people who are non-binary or trans have a different set of healthcare concerns and struggles. And then, of course, given different ethnic demographics, they have different healthcare historical engagements as well as what are the ethics around there. So that is a great question. I'm pretty sure that in the healthcare chapters, there's likely references to frameworks, but I'm not sure the depth in which each chapter is able to go through them, given all of these existing issues.
Is it
Yeah,
okay
that's what I
if
was trying to look at. Yeah, while you were talking. I didn't get there though. I'm sorry.
There is one bit of news that came out at the end of last year. The FBI, not FBI, FDA, I believe it's FDA, they expanded the TPL, I believe it's Total Product Life Cycle framework to include AI. I'm not quite sure, and which that is guiding how medical applications can be used and what type of systems it has to follow in order to be considered safe, deemed safe by the US government. Um, I'm not sure how many of the new things within that framework has exactly to do with bias, but I do know that they've expanded things to consider AI. So that also too could be a place to look.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the answers and for the question. We have another question from the Q&A from an anonymous user, and they've prefaced that it's a provocative question. So, trust has traditionally been a revolving door within and without the diaspora. Given that, what is your opinion on the work done in NIST's AI-RMF and ARIA? Are we getting closer to breaking down practitioner bias and increasing confidence in Black women's abilities?
I'll take this one.
Please.
Dr. Carlotta's like, please, I don't want to do it.
Please.
So I'm rather familiar with Nest RMF, and it has provided a step in identifying what the challenges are. It provides at least a cycle for introspection. Now, beyond that, no, to be quite frank. It doesn't quite hit the note about racial and gender inequities or talk about social economic challenges, which are across many different demographics. But what it does do is provide, I think, a first step of how do large organizations, including service entities like the US government, how do they approach this AI conversation? So one of the suggestions that I always share when talking about NIST's work is there's also the care principles that's out of indigenous communities, which is all centered on community and data sovereignty. And so I always share that as another resource that really gets to, I think, what your question is really trying to identify. And then the other one is the FAIR principles, which is more of a scientific framework on how do you now take the nuts and bolts of algorithms and now try to say what is happening in making these systems more transparent, more accessible, more interoperable, and more reusable in ways that can benefit more stakeholders in our society, right? But I do want to provide a little history lesson in the spirit of Dr. Tama. Understand that NIST, they started all this, right? Like 1991, the first facial recognition system was 14 men. That you can go back in 1991 and find the paper and you'll see it. So their work was based in white men when it came to facial recognition. So their perspective is grounded in that, and it still has that residue to this day. That's about as politically correct way I can say it. So if you want something more provocative than that, I can't give it to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall. Another great question we have, and again, please put your questions if you have them in the chat. The question is, if there was one major policy or industry shift you could implement to reduce AI bias, what would it be?
For me, I would love for there to be, this is not going to happen. I'm going to preface it as that. It's not going to happen. We live in a society where as long as scalability equals more productivity and that equals more profit, these things are not going to happen. But I think that the quickest way to minimize a lot of these biases is simply having a list of hands-off industries where AI is not able to go. There is only but so much that we can do to make sure that certain biases don't pop up in certain fields. So like recidivism, for example. Why is AI handling that? Things about facial recognition and that being used for the purposes of surveillance. Why would we ever allow for that to be a thing? AI in warfare. Like these types of things should never even be part of the conversation. And there should be regulations that say that these are spaces that we're going to hold sacred. These are spaces that's going to be required for humans to be the only participant in these types of spaces. Now do whatever you want with the other things, but for these things, we don't do that. And so I think until we have that as a baseline, I think that there will continue to be some really horrible abuses that can happen in this space, regardless of how many regulations we might build on top of the fact.
I think building on what Jasmia said, I was going to say regulation and policy. I know that Joy Bumalawimi, and I know I'm saying her last name wrong, has and the Algorithmic Justice League has some things about policy and regulation have to be there. So it's building on what Jasmia said. And thinking about something we saw in the news media last week, I think using AI to determine who keeps their job and who does not, and how we're going to scale down governmental agencies without having human beings involved in that conversation who can tell you why something's important that AI may not have any data trained on at all. So I'm not sure how they're going to make a decision about whose job is needed and who's not. I think is also an important one to consider.
And then I do have comments. Um, I did it all dramatically because I have lots of comments, but I'll keep it directed to say I think there's a conversation around self-proclaimed AI companies as being AI companies. And I think that narrative needs to change. They need to not, they need to be viewed as research companies because they're trying to optimize humans. And so humans is the product tool that they're trying to impact, influence, and optimize. And so with that said, as an academic, if you are doing human subject testing, which is what these AI companies are doing, then therefore they need to be held to a standard of what they need to be held to a standard of how they're engaging with human subjects. So for those of you that are not in in the world of social sciences, it's called an IRB, Institutional Research Board, that does a review of how you are engaging with human subjects that is equitable to them and not harmful to them. They do the same thing when it comes to animal testing. So essentially, AI companies are doing human testing. So we need to change that narrative. I think that's one way in order to shift the conversation and elevate what are the biases and how are they really impacting and influencing everybody in society. The second piece of comment that I have is there is a need for a complete curriculum shift. We are thrown AI. And as I was reflecting with someone earlier this week, I'm of a certain generation. So I remember when computers weren't a thing and then they became a thing. So what happened was that computers were available in research labs, and then it became, oh, you need to have a computer in your school. So then schools started to have, typing classes. So you get familiar with computers. And then that typing class became a class where you're now are doing things on the computer like games and like word processing and things on. And it just continued. So there was a shift in education, right? So computers were now in schools, computers were now in the library, so they're in public spaces. And then all of a sudden, they became computers inside the home. So there was a staged introduction of computers into our society. That is not what has happened with AI. And so I think that shift in education that needs to be at the core is AI fluency or data fluency curriculum that is within all industries that understands how to vet these technologies, understand what the impact of these technologies, because an educated workforce is going to be more critical and identify biases much earlier than any system rails around it. And this is evidenced by research that's come out very recently around critical thinking deficiencies for those who do not have AI literacy or AI fluency in their skill set. And this is workforce as well as college age. So I think these are mechanisms that can really push the conversation around here are what biases are, here's what they look like, here's how they impact, but an educated workforce is, I think, one of the biggest hallmarks and goalposts that we should get on board with. And I know being educated is somehow elitist all of a sudden, but I'm just going to say it. We need to be educated. And as we're educated, then we guard against the impact of these biases.
So I think we
All
can take
right.
one more question because Dr. Monroe White and some of the others have a hard stop at 1. So maybe one more question.
And can I just jump in real quick?
Yes.
Because Dr. Marshall said what I was being educated and investing in educators. So for me, and half of my body is in the education space, K-12 through, all the way up. I'm a researcher and I'm focused on the education side. It's not the time to divest in educators. And it's not the time to lean into untested AI tools in every classroom. That's just not the future. We need to invest in people. We've already emphasized the human side of this. Invest in people and the education of the educators on exactly what Dr. Marshall just listed to pass that down to young people, all whatever ages, workforce, K-12, students of all ages. Not doing that, whatever race you want to make up, you're going to lose. Whatever race towards whatever end, right? There's all kind of races going on right now. It's going to be a losing one. All right. Now I'm done.
That was excellent. Thank you. That feeds in really well. We had so many good questions, and so some of these we'll try to connect with people offline if we didn't get to your question today. But the last question that we wanted to end on is tied to education, so very fitting. And you've spoken to it a little, but I'll open it up as a full question now. What role does education play in mitigating bias in AI, and what changes would you like to see in engineering, computer science, or other curricula?
I think for me, that was the big reason why we wrote the book. When I was surveying people about the topic, even before we made the call for chapters, a lot of people said that papers written on this topic are so technical and so high level that people don't understand the practical applications of their work. It's kind of like how ABET requires you to teach ethics to engineering or computer science students. We have to get away from the coding, the math, and the science and keep the people as the crux of what we're doing. So that's why we really wanted our book to come from a practical application. Where do you see these things happening? And here are some ways to mitigate that. And I think that no matter what your field is, we always have to keep the human aspect in the loop, as we have said several times today, because I think that's a big part of it. Yes, you can get trained on all of that data and all that information as much as you want, but what does it look like when that goes live in the field? And is there an ethical application of it or not? I'm from the robotics field, and Jasmia mentioned this earlier. Should police departments be using robot dogs? So that's another, a consideration of, yeah, they can, but should they? So that's where you have to consider the ethics of the work that you're doing and how that is going to impact populations. And that's why these diverse voices have to be in the room, because sometimes other people may not consider that.
And all I would do is to add to what Dr. Carlotta said is, how do I want to say this? Okay. All right. I thought I had it, but then I was like, no, I don't want to say it that way. Let me say it this way. Senior leadership in academic organizations need to be educated on AI from people who actually are in AI, not the salespeople, actual AI people. Because these announcements coming from institutions about how they're partnering with different AI entities, it is crazy, right? So yes, there needs to be a groundswell from K through 12 and the educators, the classroom instructors, yes. Also to middle management, yes. But also it has to go up to the top of the leadership who are making these decisions. Because they're over here living in a bubble thinking they hear AI and that needs to be adopted, but they don't have any idea of the impacts to their faculty, to the students. They have no idea of what ethics really means. They just think, oh, ethics means no. No, ethics means what are you doing to the students by including this AI service? Or is this AI service conflicting with another AI service that y'all already have license for 5 years? Like, let's get everybody in the chain to be much more aware in the educational space so that we don't have these AI systems and services competing against each other and confusing students and confusing educators. I just put it out there.
I have a take that I think a lot of people in my field don't love, which is that AI is a social science, and so it should be taught as such. I majored in English, political science, and econometrics, and have been in data for 12 years. That education, while I'm the only one of my peers that had the education before I did this, I was actually at Microsoft. I was on one of the teams that made ChatGPT be what ChatGPT is. And on that team, I was the only one who had that social science background. And I think that while a lot of good comes out of computer science departments when it comes to, as Dr. Berry mentioned, the technical component, these questions are not only missed, these questions of, should this be used? What would be the implications? They're not only missed, but even when they're posed, there's not a good grasp or understanding on the researchers creating these things because they haven't been trained to think about these things in that type of critical way. And as a result, what ends up happening, and this is where that bias ends up popping up, is that social science has been a lot of times traditionally associated with women, and then computer science has been traditionally associated with men. And so, as well as people like myself who have a social science background come in and have these conversations, the majority man groups go, okay, yeah, the women can handle responsible AI, and then we'll handle this. If AI is treated in itself as a social science with these questions being posed right alongside your coding classes, right alongside your programming classes, then it will become second nature. It will be much easier to pose these kinds of conversations. And so until that happens, I think we're always going to run into these issues.
Thank you so much for those really thoughtful and expert replies. I know we're wrapping up on our last minute here, so thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you so much to our amazing experts. Let's give a round of applause to Dr. Berry, Dr. Marshall, Dr. Monroe White, and soon to be Dr. Henry. Um, thank you very much again for spending time with us today. There will be a link to this recording. Everyone is going to get a link to that recording in the next couple days. So if you missed any part of it, or if you want to share it out with your coworkers, senior leadership, whoever it might be, you can do that. I'm also putting a link in the chat to read Mitigating Bias in Machine Learning on Access Engineering. If you have any questions about any follow-up questions for our panelists or any questions about accessing mitigating bias in machine learning at Access Engineering, whether your institution subscribes, things like that, please feel free to email me and my team. I'm Kaylin. I'm with the customer success team at McGraw Hill. Thank you again. Any final words from our panelists?
Please buy our book. And I'm just so grateful to the panelists, to Dr. Marshall for agreeing to be my co-editor, to Jasmia and Tama for joining us today, for McGraw Hill for giving us this wonderful opportunity to share something that we just don't see a lot of in this space. And thank you to everyone who came and engaged with us today.
Thank you so much. My last shout out, Kate just put a great point that they have a copy of the book on order from their library. So if you cannot fit it on your bookshelf, get your library to buy it or multiple copies. Yeah, all right. Woo! Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.